Very wet up here today. Okay, apparently the meeting's being recorded, so I hope that's okay with everyone. If not, just you can turn off your camera so that you won't be on screen. So the topic of this evening's event is Powers for a People's Recovery. And I've been asked to chair it. I'm Mercedes. So if anyone doesn't know me, I'm one of the new Labour MSPs for my sins. And I have been elected to represent the Northeast region of Scotland. And I was elected in May for the first time. So for those of you that don't know ROSE, who have organised this event, it stands for Radical Options for Scotland and Europe. And it was formed to bring together people in the trade union and labour movement who want to campaign for a post-Brexit settlement that protects and enhances workers' rights at work and politically. And in particular, looking at the freedom of Scottish governments to advance democratic control and public ownership. So that's the point that we're focusing on this evening's meeting. And our speakers have been asked to consider how we secure powers for the Scottish Parliament over public contracting and tendering that would free it from the current restraints inherited from the EU, and also how we can use state aid powers to fund or take into public ownership things like BIFAB, and also how we secure powers for the Scottish Parliament to undertake comprehensive public ownership of areas like transport, for instance. And obviously we're doing it in quite a difficult context at the moment. There's been a couple of developments. So the first, the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which was agreed last Christmas. And that means that state aid is heavily policed, which includes procurement. So it kind of hampers our attempts to use procurement in a progressive way. And then there's the Tories Internal Market Act from 2020, which concentrates all powers over state aid and competition policy in the hands of the Westminster Parliament, and so the Tory government at the moment, which is taking away powers delegated to the Scottish Parliament by the 1998 Scotland Act. And that's obviously true for Wales and England as well. And then most recently, there's the Subsidy Control Bill, which is going through the House of Parliament, which introduces a number of prohibitions to prevent public authorities granting subsidies with distortive or harmful economic impacts. So basically, Westminster will have a veto on what devolved authorities or regions can do in terms of their local economies. So we've got two speakers this evening. We've had apologies from two others. We've got two fantastic speakers this evening who are going to talk about devising strategies for how we can basically move forward with progressive procurement and public ownership. So the first speaker we're going to have is Jackson Cullinane, and then we're going to have Mark McHugh from the BFAW union. And then because there's 30 of us, and we want to have plenty of discussion this evening, after we've heard from both of the speakers, we're going to go into smaller breakout groups so that we can really discuss what we think, what powers we need for a people's recovery, and then we'll all come back together and share our discussions. So I hope that sounds okay with everyone. And without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. So we have Jackson Cullinane, who's the political officer of Unite in Scotland. He's obviously also very well known as a political activist and is a long-time supporter of ROSE and the Red Paper Collective and the Morning Star. And he sits on the executive of the Scottish Labour Party. So I'll hand over to Jackson now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Well, as the Chair says, the speakers are supposed to come up with solutions. I have to say I'll be a bit thin on the ground in terms of the solutions. I would much prefer if that was to be the main debate and discussion of your breakout rooms, because I'm much more aware of what the problems are and what the barriers are, because I don't want this meeting to become a rerun, of the Brexit debate. But the reality is, as I look around me, there are people, on the screen who supported, a leave position, and there are people who supported a remain position. But of those who supported a remain position, the bulk of them, including my own union, it has to be said, it was a remain and reform position. So there is a sort of common ground here that whether you supported leave or supported remain, you have to recognise that there are real problems with the EU and how the EU operates. And the two main reasons, I think, why my union took the position of the case for reform, whether you believe it's reformable or not, was really because, first of all, the lack of democracy within the EU, and the fact that it's the unelected European Commission who come up with the ideas for what the laws should be, and then police what the laws are, backed up by the European Court of Justice, another body that isn't elected. And the only elected people are the members of the European Parliament, who only get to occasionally amend laws. And this is relevant to the next issue that I'm going to talk about in terms of one of the reasons why we supported reform, and that's the issue of state aid. Because it's that unelected European Commission who will police what is happening in terms of state aid, whether it's permissible or it is not, in terms of the EU state aid. And the other reason why we wanted, we put the case for reform and were critical of the European Union is its constraints on public borrowing, public spending, and its constraints on state aid and the ability of governments to bring things in to public ownership. And as Mercedes has alluded to, post-Brexit, we are largely still in that situation. And that's not just the fault of the UK government, who have signed up to these treaties and are now in the process of passing the associated bills. It's also the position of the Scottish government, because the Scottish government passed the continuity bill, and the Scottish government are, of course, continually pushing the line that everything in the EU is great, and that I don't want us to be a debate about Brexit and rerunning that debate. I don't want it to be a debate about independence either, but simply say at this point that we have an SNP government who talk about independence in Europe. Whether that's a misnomer or not is up for debate, but certainly, projecting themselves as being very friendly and supportive of the European Union. And I find this quite ironic at best and disingenuous at worst, because we're continually told, and have been continually told by the Scottish government, that there are things that the trade union movement asks for that they cannot give us because of EU state aid and competition rules. They tell us that CalMac ferries have to periodically go up to tender and run the risk of being privatised. They tell us, Mercedes mentioned BIFAB, they told us at BIFAB that you couldn't, come in with money that was breaching the EU state aid rules. The best they could offer would be loans to try and tidy the place over. They actually told us in terms of the Calais Railworks that they couldn't come in and take over the Calais Railworks because of EU state aid rules. And that's despite the fact that the Calais Railworks was given to them. It was offered to them by the previous employers, Mutares, who were willing to chip in £1 million to help them to develop the site. And perhaps most tellingly of all for me, when the procurement bill was passing through the Scottish Parliament, the SNP government opposed all 14 amendments to that bill. And I'm talking here about bills that would have made it, ensured that any public contracts that they had to pay the living wage, you couldn't blacklist somebody, there was to be no 0-hour contracts, there was to be minimum standards of training. They opposed every single one of them and told us that the reason why they were doing that was because of the constraints of the EU rules. So it beggars belief that they would embrace, seemingly, the EU rules, and certainly aren't challenging them. They also don't appear to be challenging too much on what is effectively a power grab by Boris Johnson. Because Boris Johnson has, the powers that have came for Europe in a lot of cases have went to the UK government and are staying there. And as Mercedes again alluded to in our opening remarks, we've now got bills being put through Westminster, which will limit the ability of devolved governments and indeed local governments to spend money in whatever way they wish democratically to spend that money. And that includes things like the so-called community ownership fund, the absolute opposite of the community wealth building that is beginning to get real support across the country. I would argue that, in terms of the local government elections in England, the fact that, there was overwhelming support in Preston and Salford that bucked the trend in terms of support for Labour councillors in these areas, that was largely due to the fact that, like North Ayrshire, they have embraced that community wealth building model. And the key aspect of community wealth building is about keeping money in the local economy and spending money in the local economy in the way that the community wishes that money to be spent. It has various other, bits and pieces. Number one, of course, being the question of, can we bring services back in-house? But it's essentially about devolving control of public expenditure down to community level. And here we have a situation where the UK government, largely unchallenged, it has to be said, by the Scottish government, are moving in entirely the other direction. And there's never been, I would argue, a more important time for public expenditure, for intervention by democratic government at local and at UK and Scottish level, and for public ownership and for different ways of doing things. Because we face two crises which require that kind of approach. The first, of course, is the COVID crisis. The COVID crisis has demonstrated that there's an urgent need, for public intervention whenever there's a crisis arises. It's what gets us through. It's government intervention has been required in order to get us where we are, and it is required in order to rebuild the economy and take us forward coming out of this. The other crisis, of course, which is very much in people's minds, particularly COP26 in Glasgow, is the climate crisis. Now, I don't know if anybody picked up this week, but there was a UK government report, which somebody sent me on Monday, which was suggesting that the way to tackle the climate crisis is to allow the free market just to rip. Because the free market would ensure that prices would be driven down in terms of green production, and this was how you would get, a solution to climate crisis. Absolute rubbish. I mean, if there was ever a situation that called for regulation, that called for government intervention, that called for taking control of the economy and making sure that it wasn't just left to the whims of the market and left to profit, then it is that issue. So these are major issues it faces in the here and now. And if the Scottish government are as supportive as they say they are of addressing things like the climate crisis, then it is a complete contradiction for them to continue to adopt a position that they are taking now in terms of how they view the European Union and indeed the aspects of the European Union's behaviour, which is now being embraced in the UK law and the way that they are, moving forward, supposedly. So, as I say, in your work groups or in your breakout groups, I think you need to have a discussion about, well, is there a way out of this? For me, I think I've hinted at, the organisational question of a way out, because I think we need to be explaining this in terms that people understand, and that's no easy. But there's scope here for us to be linking up with a whole range of allies in communities, allies at council level, allies in the environmental movement, and clearly allies within the trade union and labour movement. So we need to try and build that very broad understanding, and from that, a broad coalition of forces which are able to challenge the mindset. The mindset is effectively the status quo. They might dress it up with some nice sounding words from time to time, but for me, the Scottish government and the UK government, there's no either or in this, are equally the targets and should be the targets of our annoyance at what is taking place and our demands that we need something different to be put in place of it. So I'll leave it at that, Mercedes. And as I say, I hope people utilise their breakout sessions to have a further debate and discussion. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jackson. Thank you. That's fantastic. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's never been a more important time for public ownership. And as you say, we've got to address not just the COVID crisis, but the climate crisis as well. So our next speaker, who I'm going to hand over to, is Mark McHugh, who, as I said, is the regional officer for BFAWU, and he's also well known for his political interventions. And many of you might have seen his article in the Morning Star on statutory sick pay. So I'll hand over to Mark now. And yeah, and pin. I don't know if I've tried to pin the video last time. I don't know if it worked, but yeah, hopefully you can all see Mark.
Thanks, Mercedes. Just kind of touching on, what Jackson says, at the start. I think the key to the meeting tonight will be in the breakout sessions. And it feels a bit strange given that, the Bakers Union are historically tied into, the private sector with, the Warburtons and the Greggs of this world. However, over the past year, we've managed to build up a branch of interpreters who, have gave us a completely different, view of what's happening in terms of that. I'll kind of touch on the kind of bakery food stuff, and then I'll kind of speak on the interpreters. As Jackson says there, about the whole thing with Brexit. Where we are is, between that and COVID, it's been a really tough year in the food industry. I think back to last March, when I was getting a phone call at 7 o'clock on the Sunday morning from an MP asking us what I was doing in the local Lightbodies factory regarding members being put at risk, only for that same MP to jump my train about 6 weeks later. While she had tested positive for COVID. And I think that was just the start of the kind of the drama unfolding for us as a union. We've heard that for the past year and a bit, like keeping the nation fed, whilst 90% of our membership in the food industry are struggling by week to week. The 80% furlough payment was often seen as a great thing, but historically the food industry, one of the lowest paid, and to find yourself in getting 80% low pay doesn't really add up in terms of when you're still paying 100% for your rent and everything else. It's tough. You're told they were key workers, and these same key workers, were working round the clock. Production was through the roof. Well, some of them struggled, that supply the coffee shops and all the rest of it. By and large, production and profit was through the roof, as I says, which, has made it really tough in terms of wage negotiations this year, because, they've been telling us that there's no money being made. It's been a poor year. Profits down, profits down to 6 million this year. It's still 6 million profit. As I says, touching on the kind of Brexit stuff, you will find ourselves in a position where, a lot of the production sites that we've got are struggling. A lot of the migrant workers are going home. Only over the last couple of weeks here, we've started seeing, kind of some signage in some of the factories about recommend a colleague or a job if they manage to stay the 12 weeks in some of the sites. They could get in for £300 up to £1,000. We're seeing it now with trunker drivers. A national shortage. We're talking about the army delivering to supermarkets. Some of the logistics companies automatically, paying out £1,000 just to keep the drivers they've got, to stop them from going elsewhere. Just this week there, Warburtons who I kind of deal with between Scotland and the North East England, straight away just come in and, says that they were going to pay their drivers £1,000. It's a goodwill gesture. I think they're scared of running the risk of their drivers leaving and up in sticks and going elsewhere. But, the real challenge of that is the £1,000 weren't there when we were sitting doing pay talks for them. And which has made it equally all the more galling. So, as I say, that's a kind of bit of an overview of kind of where we are in terms of the bakery side of things. I mean, we've been active for the past few months with Ian Byrne MP down in Liverpool in terms of the Right to Food campaign. It seems to be picking up a bit of momentum up in Scotland. So, I mean, it's certainly a positive. And the good thing about, getting involved in such a thing, it kind of touches on, what Jackson says at the end of his talk there about, getting allies. And it's an ideal tool for that, when you're going out there and you're going into, local communities. I think the example that Ian Byrne, used using football clubs, getting the football clubs involved in that, and it's it's something that we're really going to take on board. I think the big challenge is, when we talk about the Scottish Government, I think somebody somewhere's, got to say, well, why are we even talking about this? 2021. Why is that even, kind of brought to the forefront of, the real struggle out there? Touching on what I was saying there about the interpreters as well. I mean, we've had an interpreters branch now for just over a year, and it's made up of, kind of all nationalities. Initially, they came to the Bakers Union through a lot of the sites that we were organising in, whereby there could be anything up to 16 nationalities. So, kind of built up that relationship with them. However, on the back of that, I mean, we've heard about the other work that they do in terms of, like, say, the public sector, for the police, the courts, child protection, NHS. The real challenges I've got with procurement, and whereby the agencies are charging like £35 an hour. Now, some of the interpreters are getting £17 an hour, and when I mention that to people in the kind of the food industry and Bakers Union members and things like that, to kind of start a discussion, they'll say, well, £17 an hour, that's a dream for us. But see if they are working in the courts or child protection, for instance, and they're blocked out a day, they're expecting to get 8 hours at £17. However, it's none further from the truth, whereby they maybe go into the court, they're in the court for 40 minutes, and all of a sudden they're sent home. So that's their pay for that day, 40 minutes. So by the time they take their kind of travelling time into that, they might only be getting £17 a day. A lot of them work in the NHS. And we contacted, Jean Freeman about it. We contacted Humza Yousaf regarding, the procurement with Global Logistics, the agency, I think most Global International Logistics, I think they're called. And, the response we get back for the Scottish Government, it's nothing short of shameful, in the sense that, it's a robust procurement process. No one's getting left alone. But most of the people, the interpreters that are working with the NHS, might have like kind of 16-hour contracts, 24-hour contracts with the NHS, but they fell through the kind of the loopholes, if you like, in terms of none of them get any of the £500 payments. A lot of them are left through the whole COVID campaign with virtually nothing. Any work that they were doing was, through like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, things like that, where they found that instead of getting paid for hours, they were beginning to get paid for minutes. So I think there's a real fight out there in terms of, did they realise how big this was? It's something that's probably out of our comfort zone in terms of dealing with interpreters and, the challenges that they've got. But, we've probably been a wee bit parochial in the past, working with the interpreters, finding out that, you know, they've got loads of work outside of the food industry, and it's opened a whole new, you know, kind of ball game for us, if you like. So again, that's what we're up to with interpreters, and the challenges out there for them just as equally as it is for, you know, the food workers. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks very much. Yeah, it makes it all the more galling knowing that the government voted against all those amendments that would have strengthened procurement and tied
Absolutely.
it to living wage and banning 0-hour contracts. So hopefully this is something that we can talk about more in our breakout groups. So it's 7:30. So I would suggest we go into groups for 20 minutes, if that sounds okay with people. So John is going to create some groups. I think he's going to create about 6 maybe. So there'll be 4 or 5 people in each group, and we'll have a chance to discuss in more detail the powers that we think we need and the demands that we want. And then I think maybe it would be a good idea to take a kind of 5-minute break after that and then come back, then we can feed back to the whole group and hear about everyone's discussions. So John, let me know when you're ready with the groups. And in the meantime, I'll just keep waffling, I suppose.
6 groups ready to be created.
Okay, no waffle for any of you then.
And
You're
might
lucky.
be useful to appoint people to report back. Do we want to do that, or is that too formal?
Well, I suppose, are you going to put them into groups randomly? So then people can just, we'll just ask maybe 1 or 2 people to share from each group. Maybe 1, I guess, if there's only 4 or 5 people.
Yeah.
So we'll leave it to the groups to nominate someone, draw straws. And don't forget to introduce yourselves if you don't know the other people in your group. And keep it comradely, of course, goes without saying. Not that any of you lovely people need to be told that. Okay, John, over to you.
Okay, I think there's just 3 of us left in this group, so everybody should unmute. There's, as far as I can see, is Stuart and Willie and myself. Hello. Stuart, you there? Oh dear. Stuart, are you there? I think only 2 of us left. I think this has not been a good idea to go into breakout rooms because people seem to be bit allergic to doing so. Hello? Ah, okay. Well, I think Willie Payton may have been the same, because he's actually dropped out. Ah, dear, 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 dear.
Oh yeah.
That was a bit abrupt here, John.
Are we back in the main meeting now, eh?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a bloody shame. I was just about to do a little Christopher Lee impression as well.
I was still waiting, Daniel. Come on.
On you go, Daniel. On you go.
All right. Your swords, please. You don't want to make a mess of things in front of the Chancellor. Good. Twice the pride, double the fall.
Think he's got a future there, Marty. Eh? A little learner. Eh?
I think I prefer your voice, Raymond. You've got a better chance.
So have you got a future, Raymond?
Hey, my future's well past.
A future at the Dundee sits?
My future's past, man.
Not at all.
The only thing fishing me is the fucking wooden box. Eh?
Raymond, many years to go yet, and by that time it'll be cardboard boxes, hopefully not wooden ones.
Correct, eh? Or maybe just a shroud, Tommy. There might not be any trees left. No, we'll not be like to cut a tree down. There'll definitely be a shroud. Yeah. Better hear hammer and sickle on it, that's what I'm saying. I've got my funeral up planned anyway. I've paid for it and planned it up. Paul Robeson's going to be belting out the Soviet national anthem at my funeral. Nothing like new technology in a playlist. You know what I mean?
We had an old shoe repair way back in the day. I'm learning a skill, and he always had an expression. He was asked how he was keeping. I'm still here, but I'm still in the queue, moving slowly along the queue.
That's the key to the one the hero. Eh? Arthur, go and tell them the joke. I'll go and tell them the joke about my experience with you know what? Guernica.
What?
You know, remember that?
What's that?
Like Arlette spilled the beans. About my experience. Oh, Guernica or Guernica. Do you know, remember?
No.
I went to this trip to the Spanish Civil War battlefields. We Mike Arlett and a couple other guys one year. Ken? He goes every year, by the way. And I went to this museum in Madrid. I think it was El Prado. I'm not sure. I'm not that very cultured. Ken? Anyway, but we went into the gift shop, and they were selling me postcard size copies of Picasso's masterpiece, Guernica. I'd never seen the picture in my life. And next to the postcards, there was coloured pencils, kind of like me Bairnsies for colouring in. And I said, oh, the postcard, eh? And I went, and I looked at it, it was black and white, and I went, fuck, have you got a colour in? There I laughing, right? But I went upstairs and I saw the massive pen and it was on black and white. I says, you are one plonker, man.
Story Raymond's told that when Picasso was in occupied France during the war, and a Nazi officer approached him and says, you're Picasso, and produced one of these postcards with the painting on it. Said to Picasso, was it you that done this? He says, no, it was you lot that done it.
Right. That's a true story, actually. Hey, that's a true story.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
All right.
Welcome back. Sorry, I was just really quickly eating something. I hope everybody had fun in their breakout rooms. Room 4 was a blast, but it sounds like some of the other rooms were even wilder. So I can't wait to hear what you were all talking about. Shall we just do them numerically? Start with room 1 and work through. Does everyone remember what room they were in? It would have popped up at the start.
I think I was definitely in room 1, and I'm the reporter back. We didn't I'm afraid to say, come up with any groundbreaking thinking in this. We acknowledged how formidable the obstacles were to progressive advance at the moment, along the lines that you'd outlined at the beginning, Mercedes. I looked at some examples actually of what was happening in wider Europe in terms of it's stuff from the website Open Democracy about how EU regs were actually able to limit progressive advances. I'll just give you one of them. It was the three cities that were looked at were Naples, Barcelona, and Grenoble. I think it was in Grenoble, the local council, as part of a movement pretty much like the North Ayrshire community wealth building approach, it wanted to get local producers of organic food to supply schools, you know, for good reasons you might imagine. And they used the EU regulations that geography cannot be a criteria when you're putting something out to tender, and therefore you couldn't say that the produce had to be local. So that allowed big corporates to continue to, you know, say, well, in that case, we've got a way into this particular authority. And there was other examples. One of them, for example, was that the council wanted to put in a condition that their electricity provider would not cut off folk if they couldn't afford to pay the bill. And again, they used EU regs to stop that, on the grounds that it was actually impeding, it was impeding the market and the right of companies to make profit. So these things that we're dealing with, the TCO with the EU and the market interventions that Johnson is making are actually very serious, and we have to develop, and it'll become increasingly serious for local authorities like North Ayrshire. So far, Preston's managed to dodge it. I don't know how long that's going to be sustainable, but we need to build, as folk were saying before the break, and the group I was in, we're pushing this strongly. We need to build a broad-based alliance to try and take this kind of agenda forward. And Richard was suggesting, for example, that Unite Community could play a pivotal role in that. So I'll shut up at that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Vince. Does anyone else from room one want to add anything? Not that what Vince said wasn't perfect, but just want to give everyone opportunity. Otherwise, we'll move on to room two. If room two folk can remember who they are.
I think that was me.
Brilliant. Thank you.
The feedback. I'm not sure it was quite exciting as some of the others sound, but it was very good discussion, very useful discussion. No singing, no raucous behaviour though. I think there was a theme running through the discussions, picking up on what had gone before, but I guess it crystallised for me when it was someone saying that the Scottish Government should be using the powers it has, and has actually failed to do that in a number of ways, and that the procurement bill, as was mentioned in the introduction, was I guess exposed their lack of interest in using those powers effectively. Not even, they didn't even challenge the EU to come and stop them. They preempted the EU by saying, oh, we can't do it. And they did that on a number of occasions. But the procurement bill was really a vital one for some of the workers' rights that we should have been defending. I mean, the blacklisting, 0 hours contract. It was pointed out that we're actually going backwards in terms of many rights. The idea of like the interpreters basically in the same position that people working in the docks would have been. You stand there waiting for a bit of work, and you've no idea how long it will last or what you will actually end up earning. And that took us on to like the whole issue of how employers have been subsidised to pay the living wage. So even things that appear progressive are actually being used to divert public money to private companies. And I think one area that really, I think, raised some genuine concerns was the National Care Service, which could sound, you know, an excellent idea in the Corbyn Manifesto, but the way it's being interpreted in Scotland is to establish a quango, which will take many, many workers out of public sector with the possible detriment to their terms and conditions, rather than taking people out of the private sector or the third sector where they haven't been able to meet the standards that we would want in a care service, and bringing them into the public sector. There is a danger that through this we're going to end up with more people working for terms and conditions that are unacceptable. Municipalisation was a word that was used, which I think is one that we should be looking at. You know, that we should be encouraging local authorities to, where we can't win perhaps at a Scottish-wide level, we can win things locally. And obviously North Ayrshire is an example for how this can be done, but we should be making demands of even SNP-led councils to go down this route. And just to add that when we were looking at the public procurement and all of that, climate change came up again and again, because we were talking about shifting stuff across the world that could be produced and manufactured here in Scotland, and that as Vince said earlier, that having local as a requirement in your procurement should be demanded, and we should be appealing to people who are concerned about the climate to join in on that. And the Greens in particular should be told that, you know, if they're not total hypocrites, they should be joining in on this. So there was a sort of circle that brought us back to procurement, and it was a very, very useful and interesting discussion.
Thanks, Pauline. Sounds very interesting. You've covered loads. Brilliant. Okay, shall we move on to room 3? Who was in room 3? Robert.
I'm Robert Boyer. I'm the last minute secretary. I'll just mention the 3 things that we discussed which haven't been brought up already. We thought the progressive federalism concept is a good one. We've noted that there hasn't been any influence in England and something that ought to be done about promoting the discussion of it there. That is not very promising though, because in the early Blair years there was a plan to introduce regional assemblies in some parts of England, and they were firmly crushed in local referendum. We also took a pot shot at the SNP, arguing that it's not left, although it often pretends to be in late courts for trade unions. Noted that the SNP government relies almost entirely on big business to provide the infrastructure of any of their grand policies. In particular, we also noted that the discussion matter of free ports, we noted that sort of thing that doesn't actually create any jobs, it has a tendency to displace them from one part of the country to another. And we also saw a good example of how the SNP simply replaced the concept of free ports with exactly the same thing. They call it green ports, just to be different. That's it.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, the whole Freeport Greenport thing is very frustrating. It's a greenwash. Okay, so next we've got room 4, and we've got Hugh to cover room 4 for us. That was my room, so I think it was the best room. Sorry.
Yeah, well, following on from Jackson and Mark's points in the earlier session, we started off with a critique of the ability of the private sector to solve any of the immediate or long-term problems. Points were made, examples were given, like and Mark's point about the inability of the private sector to transport stuff. The immediate response of the UK government was to sort of water down the health and safety regulations on hours driving. So, rather, than tackle that is only a short-term answer to what is a long-term problem of the private sector, just failing to train or develop a workforce. And this wasn't only in the transport industry, but right across the whole spectrum. There's interesting points made about a similar situation in the health service. I mean, COVID has shown up, the long-term problems with underinvestment in the health service, and what governments of any character, both UK or Scottish, have to tackle the long-term problems about training up the workforce in the health service, doctors, nurses, ancillary workers, not as at present hiving off their problems to the private sector. In fact, there was an interesting article in Channel 4 News last night about the scandal of the private sector and the testing regime that's been set up, and absolute profiteering which is going on in that. We concluded the discussion with essentially what we needed, tackling things like the health service and the climate emergency was strategies for a just transition, rather than seeing, mass unemployment resulting. We have to have a just transition, to a fairer economy, and concluded with the need for a national strategy. So we need a national strategy being developed. So I'll conclude at that.
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, brilliant. We definitely need a national strategy, even if I did say it myself. Okay, room 5, I think we're on now. Who was in room 5?
I've been given the job of reporting back for room 5.
Brilliant. Hi, Raymond. The floor is yours.
Yeah, we took our starting point for some of the comments made by the opening statements. God, I'm rubbish, I'm getting dementia, by Jackson and the young lad for the Bakers Union, I forget his name. Sorry, Mark McHugh. And that was that the hurdles which the European Union had put in place to frustrate the building of socialism through Western Europe have now been adopted by both the Tory and the SNP governments, and that those are the real barriers to any progressive advance for the working class. We felt that we really had to build on the success of the People's Assembly and broaden its scope into an anti-monopolies alliance, which would just owe a broad movement with organised working class at its centre, actually bulldozing ahead for an alternative strategy to meet the needs of the economy, working people and their families. That COVID had accelerated trends that were already developing within the capitalist economy, and that those trends were inimical to the interests of working class people. We felt that a major effort should be made to challenge the lengthy supply chains which are endemic to climate catastrophe, that those supply chains should be local, and that every effort should be made to support local industry. That the immediate needs of the working class under attack for things like fire and rehire had to be challenged in a wider context. That there had been a lack of solidarity action in support of workers currently in struggle, and include workers in the health and caring services in this regard. We felt that eventually, if this strategy is successful, the SNP will become irrelevant, and that the whole political debate in Scotland will swing to the left and to a more meaningful level of discussion. We also felt that climate change was a bigger danger than the danger during the Cold War period or a thermonuclear exchange, because in a thermonuclear exchange, some elements, some areas in the planet will survive. There'll be climate change, but the only people that are going to be survive are very numbers of human beings hanging on by their fingernails in some remote parts of the planet. That climate change is the most serious threat our class is facing at the moment, and something drastic requires to be done. That's why we say we should be building a broad alliance, an anti-monopoly alliance, mainly because, especially in the private sector, the majority of workers haven't got a clue who their employer is, who their boss is. They might know their manager, but they don't care who owns the firm or the workplace. And that's because these investment companies and hedge funds have been buying up private industry, and the last thing they're interested in is workers' welfare. They just want the dividend at the end of the quarter or at the end of the year. And these are now fishless people. They don't even care where their money's invested, because the hedge fund is doing the investing for them. So we really need a step change in the ownership of the means of production. We've really got to campaign seriously within that broad alliance for the socialisation of the means of production. And in short, what it means is the working class are saying to the people that are controlling their lives, get out my way, Jack, move over, because we're taking over.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Very inspirational. Okay, last but not least, room 6. Who have we got from room 6?
I think I've been delegated to report back.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Welcome.
Right. Welcome. Yep. It was just to say that we sort of had a discussion about how you effectively get messages over to support the case for, public services and intervention in the economy to promote a people's recovery. And we talked a bit about, which Rose has talked about the attacks that are taking place in devolution, and it was touched on in the presentations tonight, that there's an attack going on, and we discuss constitutional issues a lot in Scotland, but this attack that's happening on devolution and subsequently local government by, the internal market bill and so on, and the Westminster government looking to be the agency that will be seen to be putting out any public money and bypassing the Scottish Parliament. So we did think that that could be quite effective in terms of a campaigning issue, because we reflected on the fact that it's a bit like what Jackson was saying earlier on tonight, that in Scotland there probably is a majority for whether you support independence or whether you support a devolved solution. There's a consensus broadly around a increased devolution, increased powers for the Scottish Parliament, and yet at the time we're talking just now, there's moves to possibly, could end up taking some powers away, or certainly making them less influential in terms of economic issues. And we also talked about local government, which is probably in line for attacks on the back of what's happened with COVID. Further attacks on local government that's been getting attacked now for 10 or more years, with loss of jobs and cutbacks in services. And in our group, we thought there could, one of the effective ways that the movement, if you like, could fight back was to argue a positive case for local government, in the sense that the potential for local government to create jobs that could be filled by local people, but also, develop services. And there's a few examples we come up with, such as, people in education, classroom assistants, people from the care sector. Paul, that was in our group, gave an example of, some ideas for integrating services in the social care field, which could be, done by developing jobs, but also, a win-win situation, improving the service. So we thought that, there needs to be attempts to argue that positive case for local government. And it did come to mind came to my mind during the discussion that I remember at a People's Assembly meeting that I was at, and Mike Cowley, who's known, I think, to quite a few people at the meeting from Edinburgh, and one of the observations Mike made in the meeting was that the right wing, the Farages of the world, have had a lot of, they've had a bit of success in terms of putting ideas over, in bite-sized chunks. Now, possibly, it's always, I think, a bit more difficult when you're trying to argue a progressive argument sometimes, because you're trying to put a bit of detail on it. But there are times when you can maybe put things over in short ways, or you can put things over in ways that give tangible, examples. And for instance, in North Ayrshire, just now where I stay, the council leader in particular have been very effective. There's quite a lot of good developments in terms of affordable housing, and they've been very effective at putting that out and marking that up, and subsequently making the case for local government and local government's involvement in housing and the economy. So as I say, that was our, we did tend to concentrate a bit on how we get the messages across in terms of the theme of tonight's meeting.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Arthur. I'll try to summarise what everyone said, but first, is there anyone else that wants to come in with anything that they feel was missed? Any other ideas or Raymond?
I missed a point, Mercedes. We all know that one of the greatest problems the movement's got is anti-trade union legislation. But if we can get a good going, broad-based movement, pressurising and fighting for the kind of things we've talked about this evening, we could actually defeat the anti-union legislation by building that movement of solidarity across communities, across workplaces, across industries, without actually consciously saying we're going out to defeat the anti-union legislation. It will be defeated as a byproduct of that broad movement.
Could I come with something, please?
Yeah, sure. We'll take Daniel, and then Jackson, I think, wants to come in. He's got his hand up.
Thank you very much. Now, one of the things that I personally believe in is the right to self-defense to an extent. I don't think, don't get me wrong, I'm not one of these gun nuts, so to speak, but I know I was doing a bit of when there was that horrible case where a police officer, molested and later murdered a young woman over in England, I started looking into the legal requirements needed to, have something to protect yourself. And I noticed that pepper spray was actually made illegal to use in the UK. And I personally think there's a lot of corruption within the police. And I think that, a lot of, and the idea of, curfewing all. When the police said, "Oh, maybe women shouldn't go out at night," I think that that's an absolutely disgusting proposal for them to even consider. And I personally think that we need to propose laws that make it easier for women and men or anyone to be able to protect themselves against criminals.
Thanks very much, Daniel. I'm going to go straight over to Jackson just so that we have time to take his point before we wrap up.
I just want to very quickly pick up on two of the points that was made in the report backs. The first one is a couple of people mentioned about the situation with lorry drivers and the shortage of lorry drivers and being able to transport goods across the country. And somebody said, you know, this shows that how private business was incapable of providing these things. And that's correct. But there's actually an even more sort of immediate demonstration of how there's a need for public investment here. Because the real reason why there's a shortage of lorry drivers is because being a lorry driver is a horrible, thankless task. You're away from home, you're sleeping in a cab, you're unsafe, your lorry can get robbed, and you don't have any facilities, neighbour to wash, neighbour to have a decent meal. That Hale A9 right across Scotland, the only place you can stop a lorry is in a lay-by. Now, the reality here is that this needs to be recognised and should be recognised now as part of the crisis of food deliveries, how necessary this job is, and government should be investing in producing decent lorry facilities and parks to enable people to join the industry and begin to have a decent employment without the excessive working hours and the poor working conditions. And that public investment would come up against the EU state aid rules, potentially. So you see how all these things begin to link together? There's also a linkage between what Raymond said about anti-union laws and the things people have been talking about in terms of climate change and the need for a just transition. Because the only just transition is a worker-led just transition. One that recognises that people need to have guaranteed jobs, people need to have employment where they've got some control over that type of employment, and that means strong trade union organisation at the workplace. So all these things link together, and I just thought it was important to make that point, that some of the things that came up in the work groups might not be immediately connected, but are indeed part of the same overall mosaic here. Thanks.
Thanks, Jackson. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Everything always comes back to workers' rights, worker empowerment, and linking that in with the climate and tackling the climate emergency. So we've heard lots of brilliant things from all the breakout groups, talk about localism, procurement, municipalization, not greenwashing, and having some kind of national long-term strategy for our different industries and sectors, especially the industries that we want to be moving away from, like oil and gas. We need to have a plan so that it's fair. And then we've also heard a few times, multiple times, about the obstructionism from the EU, and why it's so important that we bring these powers back to the Scottish Parliament, and back to the different regions and nations, so that we can enact this democratic socialism that we so desperately need. So I'd like to end there by thanking all of our speakers and everyone who contributed in the breakout groups, and the amazing scribes who fed back at the end, and anyone and everyone that's come along and made a point. So Rose do regular events, and they also do put out bulletins, like kind of newslettery type thing. So there'll be something coming off the back of this event, and then keep an eye out for future events where we hope to have more women speakers and hopefully more women attendees as well. Not that it hasn't been an absolute pleasure to spend the last 90 minutes with all of you. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you all again soon. Take care. Bye.
Good night, everyone. Good to see you all.
Cheerio.
Take care. Cheers.